The year was 1944. Europe was still under the grip of the Third Reich. Allied bombers roared nightly over occupied France, but victory on paper meant nothing without boots, fuel, and food on the ground. The invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, was more than a military assault. It was the largest logistical challenge in human history. Over 150,000 men were set to land on D-Day, with thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of tons of supplies behind them. Every bullet, every ration, every drop of fuel had to cross the English Channel. But there was one obstacle that threatened the entire plan: ports. The German High Command, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, knew this well. Ports were lifelines. Without them, any invading force would starve within weeks. The Wehrmacht fortified every major harbor along the French coast with heavy artillery, bunkers, and underwater obstacles, a deadly network known as the Atlantic Wall. The Allies could land on the beaches. They could even take ground. But without a deep-water port to unload supplies, they couldn't stay. That grim reality was understood by Winston Churchill himself. In 1942, after the failed raid on Dieppe, where thousands of Allied soldiers died trying to capture a port, Churchill realized the truth. Taking a harbor was suicidal. So he asked a different question, one no general had dared to ask. If we cannot capture a port, why not build one? In a now famous memo titled Piers for Use on Beaches, Churchill wrote the words that would spark one of the most daring engineering feats in wartime history. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. His idea seemed absurd. Floating docks the size of city blocks, towed across a storm-torn sea, assembled under fire. It sounded like something out of science fiction. But Britain's engineers, worn and brilliant from years of war, took the challenge personally. By 1943, design trials began along the British coast. Prototypes were built in secret: massive concrete blocks, floating roadways, steel caissons, and artificial breakwaters. The plan was staggering in scale: 2 entire harbors, codenamed Mulberry A for the Americans at Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B for the British at Gold Beach. Each would include floating piers capable of unloading thousands of tons of cargo per day, protected by sunken ships and concrete barriers to calm the waves, and all of it had to be built in sections, towed more than 100 miles across the channel, and assembled faster than the Germans could react. To the engineers, it wasn't just an assignment, it was a race against history. Failure meant starvation for the troops. Success meant the liberation of Europe. As D-Day approached, thousands of workers across Britain labored night and day in secrecy. Shipyards were converted into mold sites. Farmers watched as fields filled with steel pontoons and floating bridges. Every village near the coast became a workshop of war. By June 1, 1944, more than 600,000 tons of steel and concrete lay waiting. The Allies weren't just preparing to invade France, they were preparing to bring an entire port with them. From Dover's cliffs to Scotland's shipyards, men whispered about a mysterious project: the harbors that will float. No one yet knew that in less than 2 weeks, those floating harbors would face their ultimate test, under bombs, under storms, under German disbelief. And the world would witness how engineering, not just firepower, would decide the war in Europe. In the months leading up to D-Day, Britain became a single, unified workshop, a nation of engineers, laborers, and dreamers building something the world had never seen. Along the Thames and Clyde, shipyards thundered day and night. Steel was bent, riveted, and shaped into colossal frames that would one day rest on the waves. The project's secrecy was absolute. Only a handful of officers and engineers even knew the full scope of what they were building. These were not ships or submarines. They were artificial harbors, floating cities designed to survive the wrath of the Atlantic. Each Mulberry harbor would consist of several key components: Phoenix caissons, massive hollow concrete blocks, some weighing over 6,000 tons designed to be sunk in place to form breakwaters; whale floating roadways, long steel bridges that flexed with the sea, connecting ships to the beach; spud pierheads, adjustable piers that rose and fell with the tides, allowing constant unloading; gooseberries, old warships deliberately sunk offshore to act as additional barriers against waves and enemy fire; Together, these parts would form a self-contained harbor, capable of unloading up to 7,000 tons of supplies a day. To create them, more than 200 construction sites were spread across Britain. Entire towns were reshaped to produce this secret machinery of invasion. Workers built Phoenix caissons in dry docks, then floated them out to the Thames estuary under cover of darkness. From above, reconnaissance aircraft saw only scattered shapes at sea, decoys meant to confuse the Luftwaffe. The operations mastermind was the British War Office, working closely with the U.S. Navy's Seabees, construction battalions. Men like Alan Beckett, who designed the Whale roadways, and Admiral Ben Moriel, who oversaw American logistics, turned sketches into steel reality. The planning was intricate beyond belief. Every section was numbered, catalogued, and assigned a position in the final harbor. Each harbor would be towed across the English Channel, a convoy of floating giants, in the narrow window between tides, weather, and German patrols. But time was not their only enemy. The Germans were watching. Field Marshal Rommel, appointed to defend France, had ordered reconnaissance along the coast. He believed the Allies would strike where ports existed, at Calais, Cherbourg, or Le Havre. To him, the beaches of Normandy were too shallow, too unprotected. The idea of constructing an entire port offshore never even entered his calculations. That ignorance became the Allies' greatest advantage. By early June 1944, the components of the Mulberries began to move. From the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth, and Selsey Bill, columns of strange floating objects crept into the channel, escorted by destroyers and corvettes. To German radar operators, it looked like chaos, hundreds of targets unidentifiable and spread across the sea. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by Allied air superiority, couldn't mount an effective reconnaissance. Meanwhile, across southern England, the invasion forces gathered 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and over 2 million men preparing to cross the Channel. On the eve of June 5th, bad weather forced Eisenhower to delay the invasion by 24 hours. The seas roared and the winds tore at the ships, but within those waves the floating harbors waited, ready. At dawn on June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord began. The beaches of Normandy erupted with fire and courage. As infantry stormed the sand, as paratroopers fell behind enemy lines, the Mulberry engineers followed close behind. Their mission equally vital, but silent. They weren't there to fight. They were there to build. And what they would build under relentless attack would shock even the German generals who believed no invasion could sustain itself without a port, because soon, the impossible would begin to take shape, right on the waves. The first landings on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of liberation. Yet for the engineers and Seabees who followed, the war was only beginning. Behind the thunder of artillery and the chaos of Omaha Beach, teams of construction battalions prepared to perform a miracle under fire. While soldiers crawled across the sand under machine gun fire, these men brought with them steel girders, floating pontoons, and massive bolts, not rifles. To them, every wave that struck the beach was another obstacle to overcome, another problem to solve. The Mulberry harbors were not built on land. They were assembled in the most unforgiving battlefield on Earth, the open sea. Imagine constructing a bridge while standing on water, under bombing runs and against a relentless tide. That was the daily reality for the engineers. Each Phoenix caisson had to be precisely sunk into place to form the outer wall of the harbor. A single error in positioning could destroy the entire structure. Divers worked blind beneath the waves, guiding cables through murky water filled with debris and fuel. Above them, ships maneuvered carefully to anchor floating piers that swayed with every swell. The Whale roadways were another masterpiece of innovation. These steel bridges stretched for hundreds of meters, connecting supply ships directly to the beach. They flexed with the movement of the ocean, each segment rising and falling independently, a design that saved the structure from snapping during storms. The Allied engineers faced a race against both time and destruction. Every hour counted. Each night, under the glow of burning ships and tracer fire, welders worked by flashlight. The clang of hammers echoed across the waves. From afar, it looked like a city being born out of smoke and salt water. And it was. By the end of D-Day +3, The skeletons of 2 floating harbors began to appear. Ships were unloading jeeps, ammunition, and tanks directly onto the makeshift piers. Supplies were rolling into Normandy faster than any German commander thought possible. For the Allies, winning Normandy wasn't about the landings, it was about sustaining them. Every modern army runs on logistics. Bullets, fuel, rations, when without them even victory becomes defeat. The Mulberry harbors became the arteries that fed the heart of the invasion. By day 5, over 100,000 tons of supplies had crossed the beaches. Tanks rolled down floating causeways. Trucks followed behind in endless lines. German radio operators began intercepting frantic messages. Reports described Allied ships unloading as if a major port had been captured. Field Marshal Rommel refused to believe it. He demanded photographic proof. But when reconnaissance planes finally returned, the images shocked the German high command. They showed vast geometric shapes offshore, piers, cranes, and breakwaters stretching from horizon to horizon. Rommel is said to have remarked, "They have built the impossible." The tactical genius of the Mulberries was not their size, but their speed. By creating temporary ports, the Allies bypassed the entire German coastal defense system. Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Calais, all heavily fortified, and became irrelevant. Every day the harbor stood meant another 20,000 tons of ammunition, vehicles, and food landing safely in France. The front lines could advance without fear of isolation. The Mulberries turned the beaches into highways, and the invasion into an unstoppable machine. The soldiers who built Mulberry never fired a shot in anger, yet their courage was unmatched. Many were construction workers, miners, engineers, and sailors before the war. Now under constant enemy fire, they built the infrastructure of victory. They worked ankle-deep in freezing water under strafing runs from German aircraft. The Luftwaffe bombed the harbors nightly, and yet the men rebuilt by morning. There were no medals, no speeches. Their victories were measured in tonnage unloaded, in bridges repaired, in tides survived. For every soldier charging the beaches, there were 100 more working quietly behind them, laying foundations, driving piles, welding steel. They knew the war could not be won without them. And still they labored without recognition. Their tools as vital as rifles, their sweat as valuable as gunfire. By the 10th day after D-Day, the floating harbors had become the beating heart of the Allied advance. The Germans had underestimated not only the Allies' strength, but their imagination. Yet, even as the system thrived, dark clouds were forming, both literally and figuratively, over the Channel. Nature herself was about to challenge what the Germans could not destroy. When the Allies began planning Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, one question loomed above all others: how to keep an army of millions supplied once it was ashore. The beaches of Normandy, carefully chosen by planners, offered no natural harbors, no large port, no piers, no infrastructure capable of receiving thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and vehicles that an advancing force would consume every day. Every historical precedent warned them of the danger. At Gallipoli, the lack of proper landing facilities had doomed the Allies. In World War I, supply bottlenecks had strangled offensives before they could achieve victory. This time, they couldn't afford to repeat the same mistakes. By 1943, British and American engineers were working on a radical idea: a portable harbor, one that could be constructed in secret, towed across the Channel, and assembled in enemy territory under fire. They called it Mulberry. In January 1944, the Mulberry project had grown into a massive Anglo-American effort. It wasn't one invention, but a symphony of engineering systems. Floating roadways called whales, huge steel pierheads known as spuds, and the colossal concrete phoenix caissons that would form breakwaters to calm the sea. Each piece was designed to be modular, prefabricated in British shipyards, harbors, and even along the Thames, then floated out and towed by tugboats to France. Churchill himself had demanded the project months earlier, in his characteristic tone of urgency. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. What began as a vague idea on a memo turned into one of the most ambitious logistical undertakings of the war. Thousands of workers across Britain, shipwrights, welders, steelworkers, and naval engineers, worked day and night in secret. They cut, bolted, and welded the parts of an artificial port no one outside the project had ever heard of. Each Mulberry harbor would cover an area of over 1 square mile, capable of unloading 7,000 tons of supplies daily, a feat comparable to a major European port. 2 such harbors were planned. Mulberry A at Omaha Beach for the Americans, Mulberry B at Arromanches for the British. The challenge was staggering. The channel's unpredictable tides, the risk of enemy reconnaissance, and the sheer scale of construction pushed the limits of wartime engineering. But as the spring of 1944 approached, Allied planners knew the Mulberries weren't optional. They were essential. When D-Day, June 6, 1944 arrived, the beaches of Normandy turned into scenes of chaos and triumph. Amid the noise of artillery, the crash of waves, and the churn of landing craft, the groundwork was being laid for something even greater than the invasion itself. The port that would sustain it. Within days, the first components of the floating harbors began to arrive. Tugboats dragged the massive concrete Phoenix caissons across the channel. Some of them stood taller than 4-story buildings, weighing over 6,000 tons each. They were sunk offshore in a precise pattern, forming protective arms against the harsh sea. Behind them, lines of floating piers and pontoon causeways were connected like an immense metallic puzzle, creating roadways that stretched from ship to shore. The Allies had built a port without land, and they were assembling it under the eyes of the enemy. The Germans couldn't believe it at first. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos showed strange shapes floating near the beaches, but analysts couldn't make sense of them. By the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. The Allies had created an operational harbor faster than the Reich could bomb it out of existence. In less than 10 days, the Mulberry harbors were functional, and thousands of tons of tanks, trucks, fuel barrels, and rations began to pour into France. The floating docks had transformed the beaches into a logistical machine. Each tide carried ships in and out with surgical precision, and every vehicle that rolled off those piers pushed the Allies one step closer to Paris. But as June turned to late summer, a violent force greater than the German army would soon test this miracle of engineering. The English Channel, calm and clear one day, furious and murderous the next, was about to strike with a storm unlike any seen in decades, and the fate of the Mulberry harbors and the entire Allied advance would hang in the balance. Before the Mulberry harbors became a headline of triumph, they were born in the muddy shipyards and coastal workshops of Britain, by the hands of men and women who would never step foot on a battlefield, yet whose work would change its course. In Portsmouth, Southampton, and along the Clyde, thousands of civilian laborers worked behind blackout curtains. They didn't know the full purpose of what they were building. Orders came stamped with top secret. The pieces looked strange. Hollow concrete boxes, steel frameworks, floating roadways. But they followed instructions rivet by rivet, weld by weld. For many it was personal. They had seen the bombs fall on London and Liverpool. They had lost sons at Dunkirk. Now, every spark from their torches, every beam hoisted by crane was an act of quiet revenge. Some engineers doubted it could even be done. The scale was absurd. To create an artificial harbor large enough to support an invasion, and to make it float, was something no one had ever attempted. But others, like British civil engineer Alan Beckett, pushed through those doubts. Beckett's design for the floating roadways, the Whalesweir, was elegant and durable, using flexible steel spans supported by pontoons that rose and fell with the tide. In June 1944, when the first trucks rolled from the sea to the sand on those floating bridges, Beckett's idea became reality. Soldiers cheered. Some saluted. Behind the roar of warplanes and artillery, the Mulberries stood as silent monuments to unseen heroes, builders who fought their battle with blueprints and blowtorches instead of rifles. The Mulberry harbors weren't just an engineering feat. They were a tactical illusion executed with surgical precision. The Germans had expected the Allies to land at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point across the Channel. Decoy operations, codenamed Operation Fortitude, fed that belief. Fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks, and phantom armies under General Patton kept German eyes fixed in the wrong direction. That deception gave the Allies the time and space to carry out something as immense and fragile as the Mulberry assembly at Normandy. Speed was everything. Once D-Day began, the clock started ticking. Every hour without a port increased the risk of failure. Supplies had to come ashore in vast quantities before German reinforcements arrived. The solution was unprecedented coordination. The Royal Navy controlled sea traffic like clockwork. Each tug towing a Mulberry section had precise orders. Routes, timing, even towing speeds were standardized. By June 14th, barely a week after D-Day, the first ships were unloading through the new harbor at Arromanches. Tanks rolled ashore. Jeeps followed. The first hospital units were landed. Ammunition depots sprang up along the dunes. To the Germans it seemed impossible. Luftwaffe pilots flying reconnaissance missions photographed what looked like fragments of floating cities along the coast. Reports reached the German high command, but were dismissed as Allied trickery. By the time the truth was recognized, the Allies had turned a barren beach into one of the busiest ports in the world. What began as a desperate tactical gamble had become a masterstroke of wartime logistics, one that the enemy couldn't comprehend, let alone counter in time. The Mulberries were not a single invention. They were a system, a living machine that could breathe with the sea, flex under stress, and survive storms. Each component had a distinct role. The Phoenix caissons' enormous concrete chambers were the backbone. When towed into position and sunk, they formed a breakwater that calmed the waves, creating a tranquil inner harbor. Behind them floated the bombardons, steel structures moored offshore to absorb the first shock of the tide. Then came the whales, those flexible floating roadways that connected ships to the beach. Finally, the spud pierheads, adjustable steel platforms anchored by massive pylons, allowed ships to dock and unload even as the tides rose and fell. Together, they created a port that could unload up to 12,000 tons of cargo a day, enough to supply an army of 500,000 men. To ensure durability, every section was tested under extreme conditions before D-Day. Engineers flooded prototypes, tested joints in storms, and even fired artillery near the structures to simulate bomb impacts. And yet, despite their strength, they had to remain modular and towable. The Phoenix units alone required hundreds of tugboats to move across the channel, an operation so vast that even the slightest navigational error could send one drifting off course or sinking in deep water. That it worked at all was a testament to Allied coordination and precision. Each floating piece arrived at the right place, at the right time, forming a chain of steel and concrete that connected Britain to France. It was engineering on a scale never before seen, and it would forever change how wars and peace were built. By the end of June 1944, Allied forces had created a miracle on the waves, but as the Mulberries stood proudly along the French coast, the sea that had carried them there began to stir again. A storm was coming, and it would decide whether these floating giants would endure or be swallowed whole by the very ocean they tamed. The Mulberry harbors might never have existed without the stubbornness of a few men who saw beyond conventional military thinking. Foremost among them was Winston Churchill. As early as 1917, during the First World War, he had floated the idea of portable harbors, a concept dismissed then as impractical. But when the Second World War began and the prospect of an invasion of Europe loomed, Churchill revived his vision with urgency. In 1942, he sent a blunt memo to the War Office, famously titled Piers for Use on Beaches. It read, "They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution." That single note triggered a wave of innovation across Britain. Yet even within Allied command, not everyone believed it could work. Many senior officers thought it too risky, too complex. The U.S. Army preferred to capture an existing port, like Cherbourg or Le Havre, rather than trust the sea to hold their lifeline. But Churchill and the British engineers persisted. The Americans were eventually persuaded, largely because there was no other viable option. On the ground, the man tasked with executing this audacious idea was Major Alan Beckett, supported by engineers like Hugh Ioris Hughes and Sir Bruce White. On the American side, General Leslie Groves, who oversaw the Manhattan Project, provided logistical oversight. It was an alliance of soldiers, scientists, and dreamers, people who refused to accept that impossible was permanent. When the Mulberries began functioning, the skeptics were silenced. Eisenhower himself would later write that without them, Overlord could not have succeeded. Leadership in wartime is often measured by courage in battle. But here it was courage in imagination, to bet the fate of an invasion on an idea. To the German High Command, the idea of artificial harbors was so absurd it barely entered their defensive calculus. They had fortified the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile chain of bunkers, gun emplacements and obstacles stretching from Norway to Spain. Hitler himself had boasted that it was impenetrable, calling it a fortress Europe. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was one of the few who foresaw the danger. He understood that the Allies would need ports to land massive amounts of equipment. He ordered the beaches to be mined and the shallow waters seeded with stakes and steel hedgehogs to destroy landing craft. But even Rommel underestimated the Allied solution. He expected them to attack where ports already existed, not to bring ports with them. When reconnaissance aircraft first spotted strange shapes off the Normandy coast after D-Day, German analysts believed they were wreckage or temporary structures. They failed to grasp that the Allies had built entire ports overnight. By the time Luftwaffe bombers were dispatched, it was too late. The Mulberries were already operational, protected by anti-aircraft guns and naval patrols. The Germans tried to destroy them with air raids and long-range artillery from Le Havre, but their efforts were scattered and uncoordinated. Within days, Allied logistics outpaced German strategy. For the Wehrmacht, it was a nightmare. An enemy that could land anywhere, build anywhere, and supply itself indefinitely. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to resist a storm, but it couldn't resist an idea. Beyond the strategy, the Mulberry harbors carried a deeper meaning, one that transcended engineering or tactics. They were built not only to win a battle, but to end a nightmare. Every crate unloaded, every jeep rolled ashore, carried a fragment of liberation for occupied Europe. French civilians watched from hedgerows and ruined farmhouses as the floating roads appeared on the horizon. To them, it wasn't just machinery, it was hope, arriving by sea. For the soldiers, too, the Mulberries meant life. A steady supply line meant food, ammunition, and reinforcements. It meant fewer dead from starvation or exposure. In a war defined by destruction, the Mulberries were a creation, a defiance of chaos. And behind that creation was unity. British engineers, American welders, Canadian tugboat crews, Dutch sailors, men and women from nations once oceans apart, now building together for a single purpose. Even the name Mulberry reflected that spirit. It wasn't a code or a weapon, just a word chosen at random from a list. Yet it symbolized something organic, something that grew from patience and care amidst war's brutality. The moral victory of the Mulberries lay not in their steel or concrete, but in what they represented, that even in humanity's darkest hour, invention could serve life, not death. The harbors stood as floating cities of steel and willpower, until the sea itself rose to test them. In mid-June 1944, dark clouds gathered over the channel. The wind began to howl, the tides grew violent. The coming storm would be one of the worst in 40 years, and it would decide whether the Allies' grandest invention would survive the fury of nature itself. The storm that tested the invasion. June 19th, 1944. The Normandy coastline, a place that had roared with the fire of invasion only 2 weeks before, now faced a new kind of threat. It didn't come from German tanks or Luftwaffe bombers. It came from the sea. At dawn, Allied weather officers began reporting rising winds across the English Channel. What started as a steady gale soon grew into a violent tempest. The worst channel storm in 4 decades. Waves rose 20 feet high. The wind screamed at nearly 65 miles per hour. The tides turned vicious, tearing at every mooring line, every anchor chain. The Mulberries, the miracle ports that had given the Allies their lifeline, were suddenly in mortal danger. Each structure had been built to withstand ordinary weather. But this storm was extraordinary. Within hours, the calm blue waters of Arromanches and Omaha Beach became a boiling, chaotic sea. Ships smashed into one another. Concrete caissons groaned and shifted under the relentless force of nature. The Americans at Mulberry, off Omaha Beach, were hit first. The Phoenix caissons, each weighing thousands of tons, began to crack and list. The floating roadways connecting the ships to shore snapped apart like broken ribs. Men fought to secure them, climbing onto swaying pontoons with ropes and hammers, but the sea was merciless. By nightfall, the waves had torn the harbor to pieces. The great spud piers, designed to rise and fall with the tide, were wrenched from their anchors. Barges flipped. Trucks were swallowed whole. One engineer would later describe it as watching an entire city drown. On the British side, at Arromanches, the situation was only marginally better. The British Mulberry, Mulberry B, had been built in a slightly more sheltered bay and reinforced with additional block ships. Even so, the storm battered it for 3 consecutive days. At one point, a caisson broke free and drifted dangerously toward the shore, threatening to destroy the fragile harbor from within. British sailors risked their lives to detonate charges and sink it before it could cause more damage. By June 22nd, when the wind finally subsided, the devastation was clear. The American Mulberry at Omaha was gone, reduced to twisted steel, shattered pontoons, and wreckage strewn across the beach. The British Mulberry at Arromanches, though damaged, still stood. In that moment, the fate of the Allied invasion hung in the balance. The decision to abandon or endure General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, inspected the remains of the American harbor. His officers urged repair. The engineers wanted to rebuild. But Bradley knew time was running out. Every day spent fixing the harbor meant less time advancing inland. He made the hard call. Mulberry A was to be abandoned. The British harbor, now nicknamed Port Winston, would have to carry the burden alone. It would serve both British and American forces from that day forward. To some, it seemed like a crippling blow. But in reality, the storm forced the Allies into a new rhythm. Faster, leaner, more adaptable. The beaches themselves became extensions of the harbor. Engineers carved makeshift ramps directly into the sand. Bulldozers dragged landing craft ashore and turned them into unloading docks. At Arromanches, work began immediately to repair the surviving structures. Sailors dove into freezing water to weld new anchors. Engineers salvaged broken sections and spliced them back together. Within days, the harbor was operational again. When the first Liberty ships resumed unloading on June 27th, the cheers from the shore echoed across the channel. Despite everything, the storm, the wreckage, the exhaustion, the port lived. German intelligence, meanwhile, misread the situation entirely. They assumed both harbors were destroyed. Reports to Berlin celebrated the failure of Allied artificial ports. But in truth, the Allies had adapted faster than the Germans could imagine. By early July, Port Winston was unloading more than 6,000 tons of supplies daily. Trucks, tanks, fuel, rations, medical units, and ammunition. Nature had delivered its worst. The Allies had endured, but the storm had done more than test the Mulberries. It had revealed something deeper, the sheer resilience of the Allied war machine. The lesson was clear. Even when plans shattered, the will to rebuild was stronger. From this moment forward, the campaign for France would accelerate with unstoppable momentum. The Mulberries, or what remained of them, had proven that innovation could bend but not break. And soon, that innovation would help the Allies achieve the impossible, the liberation of Europe. By July 1944, the once fragile collection of floating steel and concrete off the coast of Normandy had become the single most vital artery of the Allied war effort. The British Mulberry, Port Winston, now stood alone. Against all odds, it carried the full weight of the invasion. From dawn till dusk and often through the night, Liberty ships and coasters anchored along its pierheads, unloading a constant stream of supplies. The rhythmic thunder of cranes filled the air. Trucks rumbled down the floating roadways, their wheels splashing through sea spray as they rolled onto the beach. From Arromanches, supplies fanned out across northern France like veins spreading from a beating heart, fuel for Patton's tanks, ammunition for Montgomery's divisions, medical tents, spare engines, food, water, and wire. Every single item, from rations to rifles, passed over those floating bridges. In just 1 week of full operation, Port Winston handled over 150,000 men, 20,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of cargo. By the end of August, more than 2.5 million soldiers had crossed into France through that makeshift harbor. The Germans were stunned. Luftwaffe reconnaissance showed that despite the storm, the Allies were moving supplies faster than ever. Intelligence reports described the Arromanches harbor as a monstrous floating port, a logistical
marvel that defied every expectation. Field
Marshal Rommel, gravely injured by an air attack in mid-July, reportedly told his aides that the Allies have achieved a miracle, but the miracle wasn't divine. It was industrial, mechanical, and utterly human. What the Germans saw as a miracle was, in truth, the victory of coordination of engineers, sailors, and soldiers working in harmony under pressure few could endure. By late July, Allied forces were ready for their next great push. The Mulberry had done its job, feeding the invasion long enough for the Allies to capture a permanent deep-water port. The breakout came with Operation Cobra, led by General Omar Bradley. The skies over St. Lo turned black as thousands of American bombers unleashed their payloads on German positions, shattering the defensive line that had held since D-Day. Behind them rolled the armor, Patton's Third Army, now fully supplied thanks to the endless convoys from Arromanches. Tanks roared through the French countryside. Columns of vehicles stretched for miles. The German forces, stretched thin and unable to regroup, began to crumble. Within weeks, the Allies had liberated Avranches, then Rennes, then Le Mans. Paris itself was within reach. The Mulberry had made it possible. Without a secure supply line, such momentum would have been impossible. Traditional amphibious operations could never have sustained the sheer volume of material needed to support 500,000 troops. Even as the Allies advanced inland, the sea remained their lifeline. Damaged sections of the harbor were continuously repaired. New floating piers were added, and when the tides turned rough, engineers anchored additional block ships, known as gooseberries, to break the waves. Every detail was calculated, every risk absorbed. The Mulberry was no longer just a port. It was a symbol of endurance, a reminder that ingenuity could outmatch even the fiercest elements of nature and war. A quiet victory. By the time Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, Port Winston had served its purpose. The Allies had captured Cherbourg and later Antwerp, restoring access to real harbors. The floating port at Arromanches continued to operate into the autumn, unloading supplies and reinforcements until November. Then, as the front line moved east and the focus shifted toward Germany, its massive structures were gradually decommissioned. Some of its caissons were sunk intentionally to form permanent breakwaters. Others were dismantled or left to rest in the shallow waters where they still stand today. Silent, barnacle-covered monuments to human persistence. When the last convoy left Arromanches, the harbor's final tally was staggering. Over 2.5 million men, 4 million tons of supplies, and 500,000 vehicles had passed through the Mulberry system. It had served its purpose completely. It had turned a gamble into victory, and it had proven that wars are not won only by courage or numbers, but by the mind's ability to create when destruction surrounds it. From the ashes of Dunkirk to the triumph of Normandy, the Mulberries represented the full circle of Allied resilience. The same sea that once trapped their armies now carried them to liberation. But beyond statistics and strategy, their legacy lived in something deeper. The realization that even in total war, invention could be an act of salvation. The next chapter of this story would not be about tides or storms, but about consequences. How this triumph changed the course of the war, reshaped military logistics, and echoed through history long after the guns fell silent. When the storm clouds finally cleared over Normandy and the Allies pushed deeper into France, the true value of the Mulberry harbors became undeniable. They had done more than supply an army. They had changed the trajectory of the entire war. In the weeks following D-Day, as Allied troops liberated town after town, historians and commanders alike began to grasp what had been accomplished. Operation Overlord was no longer a desperate gamble across the Channel. It was now a sustained offensive, fueled by a port that had never existed before the invasion began. Without the Mulberries, the logistics would have collapsed. The beaches could never have supported such massive volumes of troops and material through open surf. Traditional landing craft were too few, and captured ports too damaged. But the floating harbors turned impossibility into efficiency. At its operational peak, Port Winston was unloading as much cargo as the port of Dover. General Eisenhower later reflected in a report to Washington, the artificial ports were indispensable. Without them, we could not have maintained our armies in France. The Germans realized it too, but far too late. Their intelligence analysts, upon studying aerial photographs of Arromanches, concluded that the Allies had overcome the natural barriers of the sea. To a nation that had invested billions into static defenses, this revelation was devastating. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, once hailed as Europe's unbreakable shield, had been rendered obsolete not by brute force, but by creativity, engineering lessons, and legacy. The Mulberry Project also reshaped the future of engineering itself. In the post-war years, military engineers studied every design detail, from the Phoenix caissons to the Whale roadways, to understand how such vast modular systems could be built, transported and assembled with precision under combat conditions. These studies led to innovations that extended far beyond the battlefield. The principles of modular floating infrastructure inspired peacetime projects, temporary bridges, offshore platforms, and even the floating piers used in humanitarian crises decades later. Many of the surviving components of Mulberry B were repurposed. Some caissons became breakwaters for French coastal towns. Others were studied by engineers from Canada, the United States, and Japan. In essence, the Mulberry harbors became the prototype for modern emergency logistics, proof that infrastructure could be built anywhere, under any conditions if necessity demanded it. The war had driven humanity to the edge of destruction. Yet within that destruction, it had also forced the birth of remarkable invention. For the engineers, soldiers, and sailors who built and maintained the Mulberries, the aftermath was quieter, but no less profound. Many never received public recognition. Their work was buried under the headlines of battle victories in liberated cities. Yet among military circles, their achievement was revered as one of the greatest logistical feats in history. Men like Alan Beckett, Hugh Iris Hughes, and Sir Bruce White faded into relative obscurity, though their designs had altered the fate of nations. It wasn't until decades later that their contributions were fully honored. For the civilians who had welded steel and poured concrete under secrecy back in Britain, news of success arrived in fragments, letters, rumors, brief mentions on the radio. But for them, knowing their work had helped bring the soldiers home was enough. At Arromanches, the local French population never forgot. After the war, the people of Normandy built a memorial museum near the beach. It stands there still, overlooking the remains of the old caissons, half submerged at low tide like ghosts of the past. When the tide recedes, you can still walk among them, vast hollow giants of concrete and rust, resting quietly beneath the gulls. Each one tells the same story, that even in the darkest hour of history, humanity's greatest strength was not in its weapons, but in its will to create. But the full consequence of the Mulberry success would echo far beyond Normandy. It reshaped Allied logistics, hastened the fall of Nazi Germany, and set a new standard for military strategy in the modern era. The next stage of this story belongs to the numbers, the scale of victory, the transformation of Europe's supply lines, and the ripple effect that reached all the way to Berlin. In the months after D-Day, the Mulberry harbors became the invisible engines behind one of the fastest and most sustained advances in military history. From the beaches of Normandy, a river of men, machines, and fuel flowed inland, a tide that no German counterattack could stem. By mid-July 1944, despite one Mulberry being destroyed by storms, the surviving Mulberry B at Arromanches had handled over 500,000 tons of supplies, 400,000 troops, and 100,000 vehicles. It was in every sense a miracle port, not built on land but assembled from the sea. This efficiency allowed the Allies to move far faster than the Germans had anticipated. Within weeks, Allied forces had captured Cherbourg, Caen, and pushed toward Paris. Each victory owed its speed to the uninterrupted flow of supplies that came through the Mulberry: fuel for tanks, food for soldiers, ammunition for artillery. All of it landed through a harbor that existed only because imagination had triumphed over fear. For the German High Command, the consequences were catastrophic. Their carefully constructed defense lines crumbled under the weight of Allied momentum. The Mulberries had turned what should have been a fragile beachhead into a logistical superhighway. Even as the Allies captured traditional ports later on, those early weeks when Mulberry B kept the lifeline alive had been decisive. Without that bridgehead, the invasion could have stalled, giving the Wehrmacht precious time to regroup and counterattack. Instead, by August 1944, the Allies broke out of Normandy, launched Operation Cobra, and liberated Paris. The race toward the German border had begun, powered by the tons of fuel and supplies that had crossed the channel through Arromanches. By the end of the year, Mulberry B was finally decommissioned. Its job was done. Europe's ports were in Allied hands, and the artificial harbor that had sustained an army was no longer needed. But its shadow stretched across every battlefield that followed. When peace finally returned to Europe in 1945, the lessons of Mulberry endured. The same engineers who had built temporary harbors for invasion were soon designing floating bridges, emergency docks, and reconstruction platforms for a continent in ruins. Britain's civil engineers later described the Mulberry as the single greatest engineering achievement of the war. It had proven that logistics, not just courage or strategy, could decide the fate of nations. American generals began rethinking the very definition of power projection. If a navy could carry its own port, it could strike anywhere. This idea became a cornerstone of Cold War military planning, influencing amphibious doctrines, modular base systems, and even the construction of early offshore oil platforms. What began as a desperate wartime improvisation had become the seed of a new global capability, the power to build infrastructure wherever it was needed, whenever it was needed. The Mulberry Project was, at its heart, a story of faith that minds could overcome what machines could not. When the world was divided by barbed wire and fear, a handful of engineers believed that steel, concrete, and courage could change the tide, and they did. Their floating harbors didn't just win a battle. They built a bridge, from the chaos of war to the calm of peace. As one veteran later wrote in his diary, "We did not build a port. We built a promise that one day the ships that came to Normandy would carry not soldiers but homecomings." Today, the remains of Mulberry B still lie off the coast of Arromanches-les-Bains. At low tide, the ghostly outlines of the Phoenix caissons can be seen, massive concrete hulks resting in shallow water, weathered by time but defiant against the sea. Visitors walk along the quiet beach where history once thundered. The town's D-Day Museum, opened in 1954, tells a story through models, photographs, and original blueprints. Every year, veterans, engineers, and descendants gather there, their reflections carried on the same wind that once carried the sound of war. To stand at Arromanches is to witness something beyond victory. It is to see proof of what human beings can achieve when necessity forces invention. The Mulberry harbors were not monuments of destruction. They were monuments of ingenuity, created not to take life but to preserve it by ending the war sooner. The sea is quiet now. Where once thousands of ships fought the tide, only gulls circle and waves whisper against the broken remains of concrete and steel. But beneath that calm surface lies one of the greatest stories of human will ever told. In June 1944, the Allies faced the impossible: how to bring an army across the sea faster than the enemy could destroy it. They solved it not with a new weapon, but with a new idea. They built mobility itself. The Mulberry harbors were not symbols of conquest. They were symbols of belief that problems could be solved not just with strength, but with thought. Every bolt, every cable, every caisson was a defiance of despair. It was proof that wars are not only won on battlefields, but in workshops, drafting rooms, and minds that refuse to give up. As the tides of history turned, the floating ports faded from memory, their name becoming just another code name among many. Yet the quiet survivors at Arromanches remain, reminders that the true power of civilization lies not in destruction, but in creation. From those steel roads across the channel grew the foundation of modern warfare logistics: modular bases, mobile support systems, and the global reach of Western armies for decades to come. But beyond the strategy, beyond the engineering, lies something simpler: a testament to human courage in the face of uncertainty. When the Germans saw the Mulberries rise from the mist, they saw a miracle. When history looks back, it sees something even greater: the moment when imagination itself became a weapon. In the end, that was the true legacy of Operation Mulberry. Not just the victory it helped secure, but the vision it proved possible. That even in the darkest hours of war, humanity can build, and through building, find its way back to peace.